May 19, 1836. Parker's Fort, an isolated outpost in the Republic of Texas, suddenly became the center of one of the most infamous raids on the Texas frontier. At sunrise, roughly 500 Comanche, Kiowa, and Caddo warriors swept across the open plains. They struck fast, struck hard, and overwhelmed the defenders in moments. Within hours, 5 men were dead among them: Elder John Parker, the patriarch of a prominent frontier family and a seasoned leader on the borderlands. Amid smoke and screams, the attackers seized 5 captives. One of them was a 9-year-old girl, Cynthia Ann Parker, whose life would become one of the most tragic and hotly debated stories in American history. 18 survivors fled through carnage, past scalped bodies, past the smoldering ruins of their homes. To settlers, the raid was an unprovoked act of savagery. But in Comanche oral tradition and through the lens of modern historians, it was the result of decades of broken treaties, violent encroachment, and relentless cycles of reprisal. Historian Pekka Hämäläinen, in the Comanche Empire, describes it as part of a broader strategy to defend Comanchería, a territory spanning over 240,000 square miles. That single morning lit the fuse for years of retribution. Yet from its ashes would rise an unexpected legacy. Quanah Parker, Cynthia Ann's son, would become the last great war chief of the Comanche. His life would challenge empires but also force a haunting question: what is the cost of identity and survival in a land consuming its first peoples? Cynthia Ann Parker was born on the 28th of October, 1827, in Crawford County, Illinois, to Silas Mercer Parker and Lucinda Duty, members of a Scotch-Irish Baptist family steeped in the pioneer spirit. In 1833, the Parkers joined the great wave of settlers pushing into Mexican Texas. They built Parker's Fort near present-day Groesbeck, a wooden stockade meant to deter native raids. But on May 19, 1836, it became the stage for tragedy. That morning's assault claimed the lives of her father, her uncles, and her grandfather. Several women and children were spared, but only to be taken captive. This was no act of random mercy. Historians note that the Comanche valued captives for ransom and, often, for adoption into their bands, a practice that blurred the line between warfare and kinship. Cynthia Ann was absorbed into the Noconi band and given the name Nauta, meaning someone found. Over the next 24 years, she was no longer an outsider. Around 1845, she married Peta Nocona, a respected chief, and bore 3 children. Quanah, born sometime between 1845 and 1852 near Elk Creek in the shadow of the Wichita Mountains. Pecos, who would die around 1863 or 1864, possibly from pneumonia, and Topsana, or Prairie Flower, born in 1858. Her life defied the common Euro-American narrative of captivity as unending misery. On the vast 240,000 square mile grasslands of Comanchería, she lived in a society built on mobility, mastery of the horse, and deep kinship ties. As anthropologist Pekka Hämäläinen observes, such adoptions could be transformative, creating bonds of loyalty and reshaping identity in ways outsiders rarely understood. But the 19th century Anglo press insisted on casting her only as a victim, a woman in need of rescue, erasing her integration and agency. Comanche oral tradition tells another story. She belonged. This sharp contrast forces a question: was her eventual rescue truly salvation, or a wound far deeper than captivity itself? By the 1850s, the world around her was changing at breakneck speed. The Anglo population of Texas surged from 212,592 in 1850 to 604,215 by 1860, driven by the ideology of manifest destiny and the territorial gains of the Mexican-American War. Meanwhile, the Comanche, once 20,000 to 30,000 strong, had dwindled to as few as 1,500 or 2,000 by 1870, devastated by repeated smallpox epidemics, including a crippling outbreak in 1816. In desperation, they increased their raids, sometimes pushing the frontier line back by as much as 100 miles. These were not senseless acts of bloodshed. As modern historians point out, they were acts of asymmetric resistance, a fight for survival against overwhelming demographic and military pressure, in a land where disease, displacement, and destruction closed in from every side. On the freezing morning of the 19th of December, 1860, a small Comanche camp stirred to life near Mule Creek in what is now Ford County, Texas. 15 to 20 Noconi Comanche, mostly women and children, were preparing to break camp after a horse raid. Without warning, Captain Lawrence Sullivan Sul Ross appeared with 60 men, 40 Texas Rangers, 20 state militia, and a few U.S. cavalry scouts. What happened next was no pitched battle, it was a sudden onslaught. In moments, at least 7 to 12 Comanche were dead. Cynthia Ann Parker, now 33, was seized along with her young daughter, Topsana, or Prairie Flower. The official story told by Ross painted a very different picture. He claimed his men had killed a dozen warriors and that he personally shot Peta Nocona, Cynthia Ann's husband and a prominent chief. But a ranger who was actually there contradicted him in a blunt letter. 1 or 2 bucks and 16 squaws were killed. There was no real fight. Historians Paul H. Carlson and Tom Crum, in their 2010 book Myth, Memory, and Massacre, dismantle Ross's version as self-serving fiction. Their research aligns with Quanah Parker's own account that his father was not in camp at all, but away hunting, and that he lived several more years, dying around 1864 or 1865 from an infected lance wound. The ambush exposed a deep hypocrisy on the frontier. The Rangers, celebrated in Texas lore as guardians of civilization, used the very tactics they condemned in native raids, attacking without warning, killing non-combatants, and inflating the scale of their victory for political prestige. By today's standards, such actions align less with battlefield triumph than with the deliberate targeting of civilians, what modern international law would classify as a war crime. Amid the chaos, 2 adolescent brothers, Quanah, between 10 and 15, and his younger brother Pecos, leapt onto a single horse and fled. For 2 days they crossed 75 to 100 miles of frozen plains, eluding pursuers. When they finally reached Allied camps in the Llano Estacado, their breathless account inflated the number of attackers into the thousands. That claim triggered a mass flight over 1,000. Comanche withdrew northward. Survival on such a journey demanded extraordinary endurance, forged in a Comanche upbringing that trained children to ride for days without rest. But behind that feat lay a deeper wound, the trauma of watching their family and community destroyed in a single morning. It was a scar that would shape Quanah's path for the rest of his life. On the 31st of January, 1861, Cynthia Ann Parker was brought to the Texas State Legislature in Austin by her uncle, Isaac Duke Parker, a state senator and close ally of Governor Sam Houston. Standing before the assembled lawmakers, she held her young daughter Topsana, the last living tie to the family she had built among the Comanche. The legislature awarded her 1 league of land, 4,428 acres in Tarrant County, and a $100 annual pension for 5 years. Officials framed it as a reward for a redeemed captive, a phrase steeped in the paternalism of the time. Yet in that chamber, her pale blue eyes and her hesitant words, "Me, Cynthia," in broken English spoke of something else entirely. A woman caught between worlds, alienated from the Anglo society she had once left behind. A surviving tintype from early 1861 shows her seated in a plain calico dress and shawl, nursing Topsana. Her expression is distant, almost hollow. Anthropologists see in that gaze the unmistakable weight of reverse culture shock the mourning of a life torn away. She had cut her hair and scarred her arms in Comanche mourning rites, resisting her relatives' efforts to civilize her again. Over the next decade, she was shuttled between relatives, her brother Silas Jr. in Van Zant County, her sister Orlena in Anderson County. More than once, she tried to escape, reaching Comanche territory before being captured and brought back. Her grief deepened in 1864 when 6-year-old Topsana died of influenza. After that loss, Cynthia Ann began refusing food. By March 1871, at 43 years old, she was gone, almost certainly by self-starvation. Modern trauma studies of indigenous boarding school survivors interpret such acts not as surrender, but as the ultimate refusal to submit to forced assimilation. In that sense, her death was a final, quiet act of resistance. Even in death, her journey did not end. She was first buried in Foster Cemetery near Pointer, Texas. In 1910, her son Quanah Parker had her remains moved to the Post Oak Mission Cemetery near Cache, Oklahoma. Then, in 1957, Cynthia Ann, Quanah, and Topsana were reinterred together at Fort Sill Post Cemetery. Historians see this not only as filial devotion, but as Quanah's deliberate act to reclaim his mother from the machinery of colonial erasure, laying her to rest under both Comanche and Christian rites. After their harrowing escape from the Pease River Ambush, Quanah Parker and his younger brother Pecos reached a consolidated Comanche winter camp on the Llano Estacado. There, they urged the camp to move north toward the Wichita Mountains in present-day Oklahoma, a relocation for safety, but also the beginning of their life as orphans. Among the Comanche, lineage and kinship determined a child's place. Without parents, the brothers faced not only hunger but also prejudice for their white blood. In the 1890s, Quanah told ethnographer James Mooney that he often begged for food and endured mistreatment. Those hardships became the crucible in which his endurance and self-reliance were forged. Around 1863 or 1864, tragedy struck again. Pecos died, most likely from disease. Epidemics in this era, especially smallpox and cholera, could sweep through native communities with brutal efficiency, sometimes halving the population of entire bands. At just 13 or 14 years old, Quanah was completely on his own. Yet he was not without guidance. By 1864, he had come under the mentorship of Horseback, the respected Noconi chief. Under Horseback's influence, Quanah developed not only as a warrior but also as a diplomat, a rare combination that drew from both sides of his heritage. From his maternal grandfather Iron Jacket, a famed war leader killed in 1858 while wearing Spanish mail armor, he inherited a tradition of battlefield prestige. From his Parker lineage, which included Revolutionary War veterans, came a familiarity with Anglo strategies and negotiation tactics. By the mid-1860s, Quanah had grown into a striking figure around 6 feet tall, with the stamina to ride for days and the cunning to elude U.S. patrols. His deep resentment toward white settlers was tempered by a pragmatism that allowed him to adapt when survival demanded it. Some modern historians see this bicultural identity not as a liability but as a tactical advantage, especially in an era when the buffalo, the foundation of Plains life, was being driven to the brink. From an estimated 30 million in 1800, the herds were reduced to fewer than 1,000 by 1880. The years after the Civil War brought new pressures. The 1867 Medicine Lodge Treaty confined the Comanche to a 3-million-acre reservation in Indian Territory. Quanah refused to sign and rejected its terms outright. Between 1865 and 1874, he led raids that killed over 1,000 settlers, numbers that, historians emphasize, must be understood in proportion. The Anglo-American population pouring into former Comanche lands was at least 10 times greater, and the raids were acts of retaliation, not random slaughter. They were, in essence, the last armed resistance of a people being written out of their own homeland. By the late 1860s, Quanah Parker had aligned himself with the Quahati band under the leadership of Para Okum. The Quahati were famed for their independence and their refusal to accept treaties that confined other Comanche bands. In 1869, Quanah organized a series of raids, including one near Gainesville, Texas, aimed at capturing settler livestock. Horses were the lifeblood of the Comanche economy, essential for hunting, warfare, and trade. These raids followed a long-standing democratic tradition. Before each campaign, warriors voted on their leaders, a practice rooted in egalitarian values that persisted even as the Comanche population fell to just 1,502 by 1870. That same year, a skirmish along the Red River became a turning point in his rise. Pursued by U.S. cavalry from Fort Richardson after a successful horse theft, the Comanche force lost a chief, an omen that could have shattered morale. Instead, Quanah took command, directing a disciplined retreat. Under heavy fire, he maneuvered the herd northward, preserving both men and horses. This tactical display earned him recognition as war chief at just 19 years old. One moment from that fight entered frontier legend. Spotting a U.S. trooper closing in, Quanah charged head-on, taking a grazing bullet to the thigh but felling the soldier with an arrow. Then, demonstrating the pinnacle of Comanche horsemanship, he swung to the side of his mount shielded almost entirely from gunfire and crossed the Red River to safety. Though folklore would romanticize the scene, its roots lay in the rigorous Comanche training that prized agility, speed, and survival over reckless combat. By the mid-1870s, the conflict escalated into the Red River War. On the 27th of June, 1874, Quanah co-led the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, commanding about 700 warriors against just 28 buffalo hunters. The Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne forces were driven back by the hunters' long-range Sharps rifles, capable of killing at over 1,000 yards. The three-day fight claimed 15 native lives and revealed a sobering truth. Courage alone could not overcome the growing gulf in firepower. The decisive blow came on the 28th of September, 1874, when Colonel Ranald Mackenzie led U.S. troops into Palo Duro Canyon. They destroyed winter stores and slaughtered 1,400 captured horses, crippling the Comanches' mobility and guaranteeing hunger. On the 2nd of June, 1875, Quanah Parker, leading 407 Quahati Comanches, rode into Fort Sill and surrendered. It was the end of the Comanche as free roamers of the southern plains. Yet Quanah's story did not end in defeat. In the years that followed, he became an advocate for Comanche land rights, a successful rancher with hundreds of cattle, and a leading figure in the peyote religion, blending indigenous tradition with new spiritual expressions. In this way, his surrender was not simply the closing act of armed resistance, it was a deliberate shift in strategy, preserving the cultural essence of his people in a world determined to erase them. By 1881, Quanah Parker had transformed from a feared war chief into a prosperous rancher, tending 300 head of cattle on lands allotted to his people. In 1890, he helped found what would become the Native American Church, championing the sacramental use of peyote, a spiritual practice that blended ancient Comanche traditions with newer religious forms. With 7 wives, fluency in both Comanche and English, and a reputation as a skilled mediator between two worlds, he became an enduring symbol of adaptation without surrender. To many historians, Quanah's life is a testament to indigenous ingenuity, the ability to navigate seismic upheaval without abandoning cultural identity. His embrace of peyote was more than personal belief. It was an act of quiet rebellion against assimilation, a way to preserve spiritual sovereignty under the watchful eye of federal authority. Yet his story leaves an unresolved challenge. In a nation where native sovereignty remains contested, can we truly honor the resilience of leaders like Quanah without confronting the systems that sought to erase their people? The raids, the broken treaties, the forced removals. These are not simply chapters of a finished book, but legacies still shaping lives today. Quanah Parker's journey from the open plains of Comanchería to the council halls of reservation life reminds us that survival is not the same as justice. And perhaps the deeper question is not just how to celebrate such resilience, but how to reckon with the ongoing debts of conquest.